And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Tuesday, February 17th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, fiscal uncertainty and payment delays are putting new pressure on contractors working across DHS and state. Plus, a new congressional caucus is stepping up to defend the federal workforce at a critical moment. These stories and much more ahead during this hour of The Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Trump administration is telling agencies to proceed with terminating their collective bargaining agreements, if they haven't already. A new advisory from the Office of Personnel Management follows two executive orders last year that directed most agencies to cancel their union contracts. That's despite ongoing litigation against the president's orders. Here with the latest is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
What is this updated guidance from OPM and what does it tell agencies to do?
What this is telling agencies to do is to really just start moving forward with canceling their collective bargaining agreements, as you said, if they haven't already. Many started to do this last summer, but because there's been several different ongoing lawsuits, that has prevented some agencies from adhering to the president's orders. And now, just even though a lot of that litigation is still going on, OPM Director Scott Cooper sent out this memo telling agencies, anyone who is covered by these two executive orders from President Trump, to go ahead and implement them, regardless of that ongoing litigation.
What did those two executive orders initially direct agencies to do?
So what those did last year were tell agencies to cancel their union contracts, citing national security concerns, according to President Trump. He used this very small portion that isn't really often invoked from the 1978 Civil Service Reform Act that technically will allow a president to suspend collective bargaining for national security purposes. And when President Trump issued this executive order last March, it covered a vast majority of federal agencies. And then later in the year, in August, we saw a second executive order expand the number of agencies that were being told to cancel collective bargaining, really leading to just most agencies having to move forward with this. And that's something where we've seen at least some agencies start to do this.
The unions responded fairly quickly to those executive orders. Remind us what sort of actions they took and what's still in place.
That's exactly right. So there are several lawsuits that are ongoing. One from the American Federation of Government Employees, or AFGE, for example, says that the orders are essentially a form of retaliation and that it targeted unions that were exercising their First Amendment rights in speaking out against the Trump administration's actions. There have been several other unions who are suing because the agencies that they cover have nothing to do with national security. So they say that the way that Trump issued this order was outside his actual authority. So we saw a lot of those lawsuits last year get a preliminary injunction to stop agencies from canceling their agreements. But then an appeals court last summer essentially granted the Trump administration's request to stay that injunction. And since then, we've seen some agencies, even though the litigation has not concluded and it's still ongoing, many have moved forward with terminating their collective bargaining agreements since that appeals court decision.
It seems like there would be some legal risk in moving forward now with the cases still open. What prompted OPM to issue this directive?
It's unclear OPM's motivation behind this directive or why they're issuing it at this exact moment, but they did talk about in the memo last week saying essentially that there has been some ongoing litigation that has, quote, delayed the implementation of those orders, but they didn't really give a reason for why exactly agencies should move forward at this particular moment. And again, as I mentioned, some already have. So this would be for any agencies who haven't yet taken action to do this.
For employees now that are no longer covered by a collective bargaining agreement, what changes?
There are a lot of changes. Collective bargaining agreements cover everything from grievance and arbitration procedures to if there's an unfair labor practice complaint that's being issued. They cover things like telework and a lot of other workplace policies. So when you see a collective bargaining agreement rescinded, it takes away the union's ability to represent employees on a lot of these topics. There's no ability for union representatives to go through the standard arbitration and grievance procedures or be able to file a complaint on behalf of an employee if they believe that their agency has taken some sort of unfair action against them. So it does take away a lot of employees' ability to push back or speak up if they believe that if their agency is acting incorrectly or wrongly against them in some way.
And if you add all of these changes up, how has bargaining unit eligibility for feds changed over the last year?
There's almost been a reversal of the percentages or the portions of the workforce that are covered by a bargaining unit or are eligible for one. So earlier last year, we saw that if you look really early in 2025, there was more than half of federal employees were in a bargaining unit, and about 30% or about 1/3 were ineligible. And then you have just a smaller portion who are technically eligible, but not in an actual unit. But now what we've seen is essentially reverse of that. So now instead of 1/3 who are ineligible, there's only 1/3 who are eligible. And then more than half of federal employees are now not able to get union representation, whereas before that more than half applied to people who were able to get representation. So it's just sort of been a flip-flop in some sense for employees' ability to have that coverage. That's something we've seen in OPM data as they've been collecting this from agencies month to month.
And Drew, what will you be expecting to happen from here?
I would expect that federal unions are going to push back to some extent against OPM's directive here. The directive from OPM talked about, starting to essentially take away or amend those union rights for employees, take away the ability for employees to use official time or use office space. These are things that unions like AFGE, like National Treasury Employees Union, and many others have already been trying to push back against. So I think we're going to see more action to come and potentially some more steps taken through the litigation as well.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for bringing us this update.
Anytime.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, a new congressional caucus is stepping up to defend the federal workforce at a critical moment. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. After a year of deep disruptions to the career civil service, lawmakers have created a bicameral caucus to defend federal workers and modernize the systems they rely on. Its goals range from protecting nonpartisan public service to improving pay, retention, and professional development. One of the leaders behind the effort is Representative James Walkinshaw of Virginia. He joins me now to walk through the strategy and goals for the new caucus. Congressman Walkinshaw, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
You've really jumped right in as a vocal advocate for the federal workforce. This important group of people have certainly been in the news over the last year, but we've never had a federal workforce caucus in Congress before. Why do you think we never had that kind of concentrated advocacy?
Yeah, it's a great question. And look, there have been for many years members of Congress, especially those in the D.C. region, but not exclusively the D.C. region, who have worked together to advocate for federal workers. Congressman Connolly was one of those for many years. Congressman Steny Hoyer from Maryland, who's my partner in launching the caucus, has done that for many years. But for whatever reason, there was never a formal caucus formed. I was a little bit surprised. When I thought of the idea, I said to myself, somebody must have done this at some point, but it turns out no. So I'm happy that we have it kicked off and moving forward.
Was there a particular tipping point that convinced you and your colleagues that it was time to formalize the caucus structure?
Well, look, I think this entire Trump term has been one big tipping point. The targeted attacks on federal workers and federal worker rights, I think, have highlighted this issue for folks not just in our region, but across the country, and highlighted for me the need for there to be moving forward a coordinated group with mechanisms to speak out and stand up in Congress when new assaults on federal workers and their rights come from this administration or any future administration.
The initial membership of the caucus draws heavily from the congressional delegations for Maryland, D.C., and Virginia. You do have some outside geographical representation. How did you decide, or how did you get members who represent other concentrations of federal employees outside the D.C. area?
So first, everyone who meets the caucus's criteria will be eligible to join. We have a handful of endorsed bills, and folks who sign on as co-sponsors to two or more of those bills will be eligible to join, whether they're in the D.C. region, across the country, Democrats, Republicans. And we kicked off the caucus with the co-chairs, myself and Steny Hoyer and Senator Chris Van Hollen in the Senate, but we are already every day adding new members from across the country.
One of the things we've seen as a result of the drawdowns of the federal workforce over the past year, it used to be the 80-20 rule, around about 20% of feds worked in D.C., 80% across the country. That across the country number's up to 86% now. So does that change how you want to make sure that you get a broader representation of folks?
Well, I think it's always been important for us to remind members of Congress that most federal workers work outside of the D.C. region. You know, they're in federal parks across the country. There are VA clinics and hospitals across the country and Social Security offices across the country, and that's always been the case. You're right, it's even more the case now with some of the relocations of federal agencies outside of the D.C. region. So we're gonna continue to highlight that while also emphasizing the operational efficiencies that come from having especially agency headquarters here in the D.C. region. You know, we've seen from the Trump administration, especially in the first term, and again now, these efforts to relocate headquarters outside of the D.C. region. It ends up costing the taxpayers a lot of money because folks are constantly flying back and forth between that headquarters in Washington, D.C. to meet with other agencies or members of Congress or folks in the White House. It makes sense to have leadership here in Washington, D.C. so people can collaborate and communicate in person.
We've talked a little bit about geographical representation. What about party balance? It seems like most of the folks who originally signed up are Democrats. Are you getting much interest from your Republican colleagues?
Well, look, first, I'll just state the obvious reality. Right now in Congress, there aren't as many Republican champions for federal workers as there were in the past. We know here in the D.C. region in the past, we've had Republicans like Tom Davis and Frank Wolf and Connie Morella who bucked their own party to defend the rights of federal workers. There are fewer of those Republican voices now in Congress. But there are, at least in the House, a handful of Republicans who, on some key issues, have taken some tough stands and tough votes and supported, for example, restoring collective bargaining rights to federal workers. And those folks are eligible to join the caucus, and we do have a number of them who will be joining the caucus. So it will be bicameral, House and Senate, and bipartisan. But I do suspect there will end up being more Democrats than Republicans. But one of my goals over time is to help build out and create a space for those Republicans who recognize the value of the federal workforce in delivering services to their constituents to come along with us and be more active on those issues.
Congressman Walkinshaw represents Virginia's 11th congressional district. So let's move from membership to agenda. What is at the top of the list of things that you want to accomplish?
So number one is to be a bulwark against the attacks on the rights of federal workers that we've seen, right? So over the course of this Trump administration, we have seen mass layoffs and firings. We've seen entire agencies, offices, and departments downsized, dismantled, shut down effectively. We've seen an effort during the last shutdown to illegally fire 4,000 federal workers. We've seen whistleblower protections degraded, civil service protections degraded. Right now, the administration is moving forward with the Schedule PC, Schedule Policy and Career, formerly known as Schedule F, which will allow for the politicization of as many as 50,000 civil service positions. So job number one for us will be to be a bulwark against those assaults that hurt federal workers, but just as importantly, hurt federal agencies' ability to deliver for the American people. That's job number one. Job number two, moving forward over the medium and long term, is to help think through and establish an agenda to rebuild from the damage that's been done, but do it in a way that acknowledges, look, even before President Trump was sworn into office this time, there were things in the federal government that weren't working as well as they could have. So how do we rebuild in a way that delivers more effective and efficient services for the American people? That's what we're going to be working on.
I know there will be a lot of good government groups happy to hear that message, and you probably already have many who are working with you and submitting their wish lists. What does action look like at this point? Are you thinking about coordinated legislation? Are you thinking about oversight hearings, other kinds of partnerships and agreements?
That's right. Well, I mentioned we have endorsed legislation already, so we'll be encouraging all 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate to sign on to that endorsed legislation. We'll have a coordinated caucus response on the Schedule PC initiative from the administration. We're hoping to have our first formal meeting of the caucus here within the next month, where we can sit down with the leaders of associations and organizations and unions representing federal workers to understand what they're facing in this moment and how we as a caucus can best help to address it.
And as you look forward, what will you be taking as your measures of success? What do you want the current federal workforce to know and watch for? And what will you be tracking?
Well, I want the current federal workforce to know that there now exists a group of members of Congress who, are committed to protecting our nonpartisan civil service and protecting their rights. And I think a measure of success will be just that. Do we, in this critical moment, help to preserve an institution, a nonpartisan, merit-based civil service that has served the American people well? Doesn't mean there aren't improvements that can be made in it, but it is a much better system than the alternative. And we have had that alternative in this country before, a spoils-based patronage system where new administrations fill federal agencies with cronies and political hacks who either can't or don't care enough to get the actual job done on behalf of the American people. So I think long-term, that will be our measure of success. Do we preserve the nonpartisan, merit-based civil service? And do we help craft a nonpartisan, merit-based civil service that's even more effective and efficient for the American people moving forward?
Congressman James Walkinshaw is the U.S. Representative for Virginia's 11th Congressional District. Sir, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, the DHS partial shutdown is stretching on, and this week's negotiations are taking place with Congress out of town. But first, fiscal uncertainty and payment delays are putting new pressure on contractors working across DHS and state. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Contractors supporting the Department of Homeland Security are navigating a mix of shifting reviews, uneven funding streams, and slow reimbursements for work already completed. Those delays are now rippling through companies that don't get upfront payments and rely on predictable cash flows to keep projects moving. We break down what's driving the bottlenecks and who's feeling it most with Stephanie Castro, Executive Vice President for Policy at the Professional Services Council. Stephanie, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Terry.
As we are speaking, the Department of Homeland Security is in another shutdown. Let's talk about not specifically how we're going to get out of this, but what does it mean for the companies who are in the business of supporting the Department of Homeland Security? All this ups and downs, ins and outs. What does it mean day to day?
That is a fantastic question, Terry, because a lot of the media, since the shutdown started just a few days ago, has focused a lot on which federal workers are being furloughed, who's deemed essential or exempt from the furlough, right? And those numbers are interesting, very, very interesting to all of us. One thing, though, that we have to keep in mind is parts of DHS do have funding. And some of that funding came from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that was signed last summer. And it provided DHS with almost $200 billion of funding, a lot of it for ICE, some for Customs and Border Protection, et cetera. So they still have some money in the coffers. And so we would see that ICE agents, for example, or CBP agents or officers are still out there and they're getting paid. But a lot of folks who are working in the federal workforce, we're going to have to wait for their paychecks. On the contractor side, those paychecks are a little bit more in question. And I say that because, one, federal employees are guaranteed back pay. So when the shutdown ends, in this case for DHS, all federal workers, whether they were furloughed or not, are going to get paid. There's no similar law on the books for contractors. And so a lot of times when we enter a shutdown, there will be stop work orders, business grinds to a halt. You've got you don't have the access to the facilities, so you can't get into the buildings, et cetera. So that puts a lot of strain on contractors. And there are two different lines of thinking here, Terry. And one is, how does this impact business planning for contractors? How do they do their workforce development? How do they think about their pipeline of work when they've been issued a stop work order or, proposals are not being accepted? The other piece is, how do they get paid for work that's already done? They've submitted invoices and everything comes to a halt. So those are the two major areas, Terry, that we are tracking very closely during this shutdown.
Well, this uncertainty goes way back to last fall and the shutdown at the beginning of the fiscal year in October, which was the longest we've had, and then some short-term funding. Now we're off again, and there's no certainty as to when this will start up.
To say this is fits and starts is an understatement. It was, as you mentioned, a historically long, it was a 43-day government shutdown for agencies, including DHS. Now DHS is facing an uncertain timeline as well. Congress is due back on February 23rd. They are subject to the recall of the speaker. The speaker can have folks come back. He said he would give them 48 hours notice, but that's only if a deal is on the table. And I don't think they're working on this currently, at least in a visible way right now. So really what we're looking at when Congress comes back on the 23rd, but they still need to hammer out their issues. And so this work stoppage for contractors who are affected, as well as this uncertainty, this fits and starts piece. We talk a lot with contractors, specifically the small ones, about access to capital, making sure that they can retain their workforce during this period of uncertainty. It does throw a lot of angst into the system, Terry.
Part of another spoon that's stirring this pot is that Secretary Noem is still personally reviewing every contract over $100,000. What sort of wrinkle does that present?
Terry, I'm so glad you asked about this, because this policy of the Secretary of Homeland Security reviewing anything that's $100,000 or more, whether it's a grant or a contract, has really thrown more uncertainty into the mix. As you said, it's an additional spoon stirring the pot. It's funny to think, the policy says, the Secretary reviews these things pretty quickly and approves them or disapproves them. Our experience is that not that it's taking 5 days for this to happen. It's in excess of 90 days in some instances, because these packages have to be put together. Everybody in the acquisition workforce who has looked at the package will say it's fine, and then it sits before its final hurdle. And it could be that the review team, before it passes it on to the secretary, needs an additional few weeks, few months, more time. My understanding is that they're only passing up packages to her for her approval, that if it's going to be disapproved, they're continuing to gather more documentation. But this adds so much uncertainty in terms of timelines. You think as a contractor, you've cleared all the hurdles with your acquisition workforce, and then it kind of sits for a little while. and you don't have a lot of insight into the process, you'd offer more information if it was helpful, but you don't know what information is missing from the review team's perspective. And so there is a lot of angst in the works. And I'll give you one anecdote, Terry. It's something our boss at PSC, our Chief Executive Officer, Jim Carroll, likes to say, is that you talk to the Customs and Border Protection guys, their quarterly coffee budget exceeds $100,000. So almost everything of import is really going to exceed that threshold. So it means the Secretary is looking at every single dollar that's going out the door.
I'm speaking with Stephanie Castro. She's the president of the Professional Services Council. Stephanie, let's go back now to something you mentioned at the beginning, the delay in payments as a result of all of this uncertainty in funding. Is it in? Is it out? Is it? How long is it going to last? How are contractors being reimbursed for work that they've performed?
That's also a great question, Terry. What differentiates one way a grant is different than a contract is in many cases, a grant, you get the money up front and then you burn through it doing the work that you were hired to do. For a contract, it's oftentimes that you're getting reimbursed for work that's already done. So you've already made payments to your employees or for the supplies or components that you need for your solution, et cetera, and then you submit an invoice to the government. And I'll give you two examples here where we've run into some issues. That we at PSC have 400 member companies, and a lot of them work for DHS and a lot of them work for State Department. So those are the two areas I want to highlight here. For DHS, my understanding is that a lot goes through the ICE Consolidated Payment Center, where the Consolidated Payment Center takes in invoices and then passes them over to be validated by the customer within the Department of Homeland Security. And that customer says, yes, the work has been done to our satisfaction, and there is enough funding in this fund site to pay for the invoice. That process, in some cases, just to go from ICE receiving the invoice to it going to the office in order to be validated is taking in excess of a month. And so this is running afoul a little bit of the Prompt Payment Act, which says once you've accepted an invoice, and that's the process we're trying to get to, the validated invoice, you have 30 days to pay the invoice itself without incurring interest payments as the government. So we are running into a lot of cases where this process is so bogged down that small businesses, medium-sized businesses are waiting eagerly for the ICE Consolidated Payment Center at DHS to pass it along to the customer and be validated. The customer is waiting for it too. They want to validate the invoice and get the money out the door, but there has been some issues. And I know ICE is busy lately. They have other things on their plate, but the payments of contractors is really what helps keep small businesses afloat. On the State Department side, PSC did send Secretary Rubio a letter. We gathered information from some dozen or so of our member companies who had performed work a year ago before contracts were canceled, but also who have negotiated termination settlement proposals. And they are owed a reimbursement collectively in excess of $600 million. And so we are trying to work with the State Department to understand better how these companies can get reimbursed for work already performed. That's money that really goes to American workers. And we have every interest in making sure they can put food on the table and gas in their cars.
Stephanie, is PSC concerned at all that businesses who have been in this space will just decide that this environment is too hard to work in and leave the space? I mean, a lot of time you hear there, we leave one and we'll get another one, but it's not quite so easy.
That's exactly, I would say it's not just what we're concerned about, it's what we're seeing in some cases where companies are deciding federal work is just too hard. They're not getting paid money that they should be reimbursed for. And they're pivoting to either work in the international community or for state and local governments, or they're just going over to the commercial side and they're getting out of government work. And so I do think it's not easy to reconstitute that body of knowledge that makes up the federal marketplace. Contractors are partners to the federal government. They want to achieve missions for the American people as much as federal civilians and military folks want to do it. And I would really love to keep them in this space. They're folks with clearances or they hold positions of public trust, law enforcement, et cetera, or the civilians who help on the backside or in the back offices there. I would hate to see contractors depart this federal marketplace because of a situation like this, just because they're not getting paid, or it's not as a certain a marketplace as they thought it would be.
How are you engaging with federal leaders to help them understand the ramifications of some of these decisions?
We have some great conversations with folks, whether it's at the White House or in the departments and agencies and on the Hill, to be honest, about the importance of the federal workforce, civilians, military, and contractors alike, and making sure that we have a robust ecosystem where we are all partners working towards the same federal mission set for the American people. And we are talking to them about how to make the marketplace more attractive for retention of companies, but also for new entrants. I mean, they do, as a whole, want to attract more people to the federal marketplace, so there are more options. You can have cost competitions, etc. So we are engaging quite a bit on all fronts on this, just to highlight the importance that we bring to the table as contractors.
I've been speaking with Stephanie Castro. She's president of the Professional Services Council. Stephanie, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, the DHS partial shutdown is stretching on, and this week's negotiations are taking place with Congress out of town. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The standoff over DHS funding is now shaping operations across the department, the next round of negotiations, and the political backdrop for the State of the Union later this month. The SAVE Act moves to the Senate, and the president touts an executive order, and we'll sort out what's moving and what's not with Lauren Duggan, Deputy News Director at Bloomberg Government. Lauren, great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
All right, this is a short week and both chambers are on recess, so let's focus on last week. Last week, we ran out of funding for the Department of Homeland Security, but not really. So tell us where we actually are and what's going on with the conversations.
So Homeland Security's funding bill was the last of the 12 that hadn't been finalized. It was operating under a 2-week continuing resolution, and those 2 weeks came to an end without an agreement on any sort of restraints or restrictions on immigration enforcement. So without that, there was an agreement to move forward with more short-term funding. So like you said, there's a partial shutdown for DHS. But it's important to note that some of the things at issue here, immigration enforcement under ICE and CBP, still have funding because of that tax and spending law that was passed last year. They got a lot of money, a big infusion of cash, and they can still operate and pay their people under that. But with DHS, so much of their work is considered essential and the functions have to be continued that I think something like 90% maybe of the workforce will stay on despite this shutdown or lapse in appropriations happening.
So given that the big focus is on the operations and practices in ICE and Customs and Border Protection, and that they're already funded, where do they think the shutdown is going to move to? Isn't it maybe better to propose separate legislation that would deal with the issues at hand?
I think they want to use the deadline, or they wanted to use the deadline that's now in the past, to force this discussion and continue it. So there is still this lapse, and there will come a point not too far into the future where people will not get their paychecks, and there will perhaps be pressure to do something by then. So the Democrats in particular in the House and the Senate have been pretty unified here about not wanting to move forward without some sort of arrangement with the administration to change some of these practices. Now, the lists that they traded back and forth didn't get them close enough, but maybe either over this recess week or when they come back, they can chip away and come closer to some sort of agreement to reopen the department and do some restraining of these operations.
So presumably, even though they're not technically in session, some people are around to have these kinds of conversations. What's really on the table and what might a deal look like?
We'll have to see, because one of the list of demands that the Democrats had was body cameras, and we saw some willingness from the administration to deploy those and use those in Minnesota and beyond. Something like masks and not allowing ICE agents to wear masks seems to be a little more controversial, with Republicans pushing back and not wanting to have people doxxed or have their identities revealed and perhaps used against them. So you can see where there's a divide between those two, and we'll see what they can come up with that fits the bill. But the fact that the administration traded paper back, both an initial list of proposals and legislative text, shows that they're bargaining back and forth. They just didn't get there quite yet. So we'll see what's in that kind of range of activities that they'll be able to go along with.
Now, a couple of weeks ago, we were hearing that there might be a move to break out some of the other sub-agencies in DHS and figure out a way to appropriate funding for them. Is that an opportunity to move forward?
That is an option that didn't seem to gain much traction. Several Democrats were pushing that because, like we said, ICE and CBP has this funding out there, but the Coast Guard, FEMA, CISA, and other parts of the department won't. So maybe that's an arrangement they could look at later, or if they want to keep it all together to keep the pressure going, we'll have to see. That didn't certainly catch fire, nor did another 2-week or 4-week CR before they left last week. So nothing that was short of a full package was really gaining traction.
Well, there's an interesting calendar intersection here. Members of Congress get back into town on the 23rd of February, and the President's State of the Union is currently scheduled for the 24th. Lots of conversation about how that might play out. What are you hearing?
Well, I think that the State of the Union looks likely to go on right now. The House, before it left, adopted this it's a concurrent resolution setting up the State of the Union. Senate needs to do that when they come back, but all signs point toward them moving forward with that address so that the president can come, and maybe that'll be the time for him to announce some of his perspective there on what he wants to see happen, or perhaps tell them to reopen DHS. It's too important to keep it closed. So we could have a situation where the shutdown is persisting while the president is talking there.
A little bit of last minute drama since the last time the two were scheduled simultaneously. The shutdown sort of won out and they delayed the State of the Union.
That could be a way they would look at it. So we'll see. But for right now, we still have the 24th on our calendar for that important address.
I'm speaking with Lauren Duggan. He's Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government. Well, Lauren, let's move on from funding issues and talk about the Save America Act. It passed the House just before they went on recess. What are you hearing about this approach to voter identification?
Well, this has been a pretty party line issue, this particular bill. It was once the SAVE Act. They added a voter ID provision to it and now call it Save America. And that has been sent over to the Senate. There are members of the House and members of the Senate who want to use this as an opportunity to challenge the filibuster rule in the Senate, the thing that requires most cases 60 votes to move forward. They're saying, well, that's the rules, but if you're going to filibuster, you actually have to stand on the floor and take up time and actually do the physical exertion of slowing down this legislation. That hasn't caught on with all Republicans, including John Thune, the majority leader, who said that might be too much time on the floor and he's reluctant to do that. But you will see pressure building to do something on that vote in the Senate because there's also the president who wants the bill and has said, if I don't get the bill, I'm going to try and do it by executive order. So, there's a lot of dynamics here with pushing that voter ID portion of the SAVE Act or the Save America Act as it's been rebuilt. And we'll see what happens with that when they get back.
Given the federalized nature of elections, is that really something the president can do via executive order?
I think that would be challenged pretty quickly. I mean, there are some things that executive orders have been used for in voting, and there is primarily a state administration of those elections, but he has talked about nationalizing it, and there are obviously federal statutes that apply to voting, but we'll see if an executive order is going to be enough or if you would really need legislation, and then there's hurdles to that legislation as it now stands.
Well, that'll certainly be something to watch. And the other topic I wanted us to chat about today was foreign affairs. And sometimes we do that. Many of the members of Congress were at the Munich Security Conference last weekend. There was a lot said. Interested how you think it's going to play out.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the questions. Would they actually leave town to go to Munich? Would it be harder to get there if part of the government was shut down? But many members made their way over there and talked both in main sessions and around about their perspective on foreign policy. We saw Gavin Newsom over there as well, the California governor, who's taken some steps outside of the administration to show that California is a willing partner if the Trump administration isn't. So even, if we weren't always being talked about to our faces there, I know that there were chatter among other nations as well. And I think everyone's trying to figure out what foreign policy and global policy looks like right now. And several members had platforms like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's the New York Democratic House member who had a pretty big platform there with a couple of different appearances, I think. So an interesting, moment on the world stage for some of these members of Congress.
And along those lines, the House passed a resolution opposed to the president's tariffs on Canada.
That's right. That was the first chance the House had to vote on that. They had a procedural blockage for most of this Congress, not allowing votes on those. But a bipartisan group overcame that, and then another bipartisan group voted to adopt that resolution blocking the Canadian tariffs. I think we'll probably see votes on Mexico and other countries as well as time goes on, and we'll see if that gets through the Senate as well. But right now, the majorities aren't big enough to avoid a veto from the president, who would undoubtedly veto any such measure if it reached his desk.
I've been speaking with Lauren Duggan. He's Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government. Lauren, thanks as always.
Thank you.
We'll post this interview to federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Data from the Department of Veterans Affairs shows it cut healthcare hiring times by more than half. The Trump administration directed agencies to speed up time to hire government-wide, but a closer look at the VA's data shows that it's using different metrics than it used to in the past. For a closer look at these numbers, Federal News Network's Jory Heckman joins me now. Jory, great to see you.
Hey, Terry.
What does this new data say about how quickly the VA can hire healthcare workers?
Well, if you look at the numbers on the paper here, VA data shows that the Veterans Health Administration was really a lot more efficient with hiring healthcare workers from May 2025 onwards. It went from about 108 days, give or take, to fill positions. And then from May 2025 onward, it dropped that by about 50% or more. It's gotten somewhere in the neighborhood of 47 days, but there's perhaps some caveats to unpack here that up until May 2025, the VA's workforce dashboard was showing this metric as time to hire, a pretty familiar metric for all things in the government HR world. And then they changed the wording a little bit. They now refer to it as the merit hiring plan time to hire. And before that, they had briefly rephrased it as the time to tentative job offer. And these are different measurements. It's a smaller segment of the hiring process than what time to hire would be. Time to hire means you identify there's a vacant position, you go out and you see who wants to apply to it, you get applications, and then you eventually hire a candidate and you have them onboarded. That is a much lengthier process than making a tentative job offer, because this is healthcare work, and by nature of it, the VA has to go through a number of steps to make sure these are candidates who are safe to be in a hospital setting. And so there are sometimes lengthy steps to go through, but often necessary steps for these people to be entrusted with care for veterans. And in some cases, this could be an apples to oranges comparison of the old data sets to the new data sets.
Has VA offered any explanation about these changes to the data, why they made them, what difference it makes?
So VA didn't get back to me in terms of a request for comment for this story, but one thing that is clear here is in the newer updates to the VA workforce dashboard, they do recognize that in the definitions in the kind of small print at the bottom, they do recognize that they have changed the definition of what this measurement captures, that it is the time to receive a tentative job offer, and that they made these changes in compliance with OPM's merit hiring plan. This was the government-wide document that we saw last spring, where they directed agencies to, among other things, get the time to hire down to where it is. It's been hovering above 100 days on average government-wide, and OPM wants agencies to get that down to somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 days.
Can you really compare this new data to the previous data? It feels like a line chart that would have a gap in the middle of it and a shift.
Yeah, I think these are completely different data sets, and VA has seamlessly slotted the new data in where the old data used to be, but these are different values. They are measuring and tracking different things. And so there are some who would look at this and find it somewhat misleading that they are, without very little notice, saying that this is what they're doing going forward.
What are you hearing from members of Congress about all of this?
There was a hearing last week with the House VA committee, and members of Congress did point out these changes to the data sets. First, we'll hear from Congresswoman Delia Ramirez. She's a Democrat from Illinois. She pointed out this discrepancy in the data, and she said that this amounts to smoke and mirrors.
Unlike your predecessor who measured the time to hire as the number of days it takes for a new hire to start the job, you are measuring the number of days it takes for an applicant to receive a tentative job offer. And that is why we can't trust anything that's coming out of your office.
That was Congresswoman Delia Ramirez. And next we'll hear from Congresswoman Mariette Miller Meeks. She is the chairwoman of the Health Subcommittee, and she praised Collins for getting this time to hire down, at least on paper. She is a former physician, and she has applied to VA jobs in the past. And she said that back when she was doing that, it could take 9 months to hear from the VA with a tentative job offer.
And so let me just say that 47 days is a monumental achievement, and thank you for that, and thank you for working on hiring at the VA, because it is a morass, and we are losing good people at the VA because we can, in the previous administration, could not process applicants or give them job offers rapidly enough.
So, Jory, put this all in context for us. VA has been shrinking its workforce overall. We've talked a lot about that. But now it's sharing these hiring numbers. Just how much hiring has it been doing, and how are the increases mixing with the decreases?
Yeah, there's a lot of moving pieces here, but multiple things can be true at once. The VA last year did shrink its overall headcount. It shrank it by about 30,000 positions here, but the VA continues to hire, particularly for its healthcare workforce. They're going to continue to hire for nurses, physicians, mental health specialists, people like that. And to give you a sense of that, VHA last year, they hired about 20,000 healthcare employees. And for some context for that, that's about a third of what the VA was doing back in 2023 when it was gearing up for the recently passed PACT Act. And this is legislation that greatly expanded the eligibility for veterans who were exposed to toxic substances during their military service, expanded their eligibility for VA healthcare and benefits. And so at that time, VA was really preparing for a massive volume in patients, in veterans signing up for VA services. The current administration, under Collins's leadership, says that the demand is not as high as they expected it to be. And so there is a overhiring in some instances. And so they are trying to map the current size of the workforce to where the need is greatest based on where the veteran population is. And to that point, and to achieve that goal, VA so far this fiscal year, they have hired about 7,000 healthcare employees.
Well, this, I'm sure, will continue to be in the headlines. So, Jory, thanks for updating us.
Thanks, Terry.
That's Federal News Network's Jory Heckman, and you can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editors are Daisy Thornton and Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.